And secondly, how do you think that activist investor is thinking about this proposal?
So we haven't heard from Value Act. Value Act actually ran a proxy campaign in Japan last year at 7 & I, and it was unsuccessful in adding board members to 7 & I. So Japan is a very unique market, as we know. And a lot of the retail investors, a lot of the stocks are retail investors, and then the retail investors usually tend to support the management. So in order to actually change in Japan, it's actually really difficult, and you have to be very culturally sensitive to do so. In this particular instance, Value Act wasn't able to make that change. But then the argument that they had that the company underperformed, that a company could see a higher stock price, that I guess exactly is what Kusha is seeing as well. With the yen being depreciated, that is a really good opportunity, a really good timing for Kusha to make a move, or for anyone else. So we should bear in mind that, again, there are so many players in this space. Everybody has looked at everyone else. So anything could happen. Maybe like another buyer could emerge. But we should expect Value Act to have some sort of comment at some point, given they still have a stake in the company.
Okay, Crystal, speaking of timing, what has been happening when it comes to timing in the deal space of late? I mean, it was just a week ago that we were talking about Mars agreeing to buy Kellanova. We have Boeing buying parts supplier Spirit Aerosystems. We have Bosch's acquisition of $8 billion in air conditioning assets. What's going on when it comes to where we are in the cycle and what you're seeing with deals?
Yeah, a lot of the deal makers have commented that this is an unusually busy summer. Since July, we've seen a flurry of deal making. And like I said, it's really unusual, first of all, for someone to be this busy. A lot of the deal makers themselves or company executives tend to take time off, and not this year. I guess partly it's to do with that the election in the back end of the year, it's really going to put a hurdle on a lot of deals. You don't really want to be caught in any sort of market cycle. So if you were to do a deal this year, you either get it done before September, before it gets too close to the election, or you wait till 2025. So this could be the last stretch of deals that we're seeing. And as you see, there are quite a few consumer retail transactions like Kellanova, like this one. It could also indicate that there are arguments to be made about the consumer strength. Potentially, it's that size and scale really does matter as a consumer retail company at this point more than anything else.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about what kind of macro signals we can learn from this uptick in deal activity. Does that mean that the consumer is weakening if these companies have to merge together?
Yeah, a lot of companies have actually passed on a lot of costs in the past couple of years to consumers just by raising prices. And that's where the growth has been coming from. And a lot of companies have felt that they have kind of maxed out on passing that cost to consumers. And for now, if you were to generate extra growth, you kind of have to be in the domain of deal making, in organic growth, by buying someone else, by getting bigger, and by going into regions and like geography that you're not already in. So that's another reason why some of these deals, mainly a lot of them are geographic. This one in particular is a geographic expansion. Kellanova is a portfolio expansion where Mars wanted to diversify into savory snacks versus just like sweet confectionaries. So again, it's a consumer play, but then also the really interesting thing, perhaps with Kellanova and not so much here, is that the effect of Ozempic is on everyone's mind as well. So if you see that everyone is expecting Ozempic in a consumer world, everyone is expecting Ozempic to have some sort of effect in the not so healthy category of food. And if you think about convenience store is also selling mostly confectionaries, potato chips. And if you expect in the long run Ozempic to have a bigger effect, you may as well have a bigger market share so that you can like withstand that weather a little bit better.
Hey, Crystal, before we let you go, just about 45 seconds left. Talk to us just a little bit about the idea of what your sources are telling you moving forward, given that we could see a rate cut in September, maybe 2 more rate cuts before the end of the year. Do we expect deal activity to increase when the Fed does lower rates?
Yeah, I think the interest rate has been a huge topic in the past 9 months. And then for now, I think most of the discussions has been whether we're getting too close to the election. Interest rate still remains a topic, but then it's not as important perhaps as something like an antitrust when you do a big transformative acquisition like this one.
All right. A big thank you to Crystal C., Bloomberg News deals reporter. She joins us from Switzerland. Check out her stories on the Bloomberg terminal and, of course, also at Bloomberg.com. We do see green across the screen when it comes to the major equity averages. The Dow Jones Industrial Average higher right now by close to 0.4%. The S&P 500 higher by 0.6%, while the NASDAQ higher by 0.9%. Coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week, we're going to check in with Jason Kelly. He's chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. He's got a preview of the cover of the next edition of Bloomberg Business Week magazine. It's about the gambling industry, and specifically this story, what NFL players really think about sports betting. First, though, a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. Kamala Harris is heading into the Democratic National Convention 4 points ahead of former President Donald Trump in the latest ABC News Washington Post Ipsos poll, but 9 points behind on the economy. Isaac Boltanski is Director of Policy Research at BTIG.
Donald Trump is still leading on the key issues that animate voters in the swing states, right? He still leads on the economy, inflation, and immigration. And those have generally been the three issues that tend to animate, excite, and define the voters' enthusiasm in the 6 to 7 states that will decide this election.
Isaac Boltanski with BTIG was a guest on Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Menace Cranny. Harris rolled out her economic policy agenda strategically. That's according to Brett Bruen, who served in the Obama White House and is now president of the Global Situation Room.
She wanted to put out not a complex theory, but some very concrete pieces that voters, especially voters in those battleground states, can relate to. They can relate to a child tax credit. They can relate to the price gouging issue.
Brett Bruen with Global Situation Room. Talk show host pioneer Phil Donahue has died. His nationally syndicated talk show was the first of its kind, where the host interacted with the studio audience. Phil Donahue was 88 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got stocks holding just about the best level of the day. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, very much in the green. Stocks are pushing higher, adding to a rally that has already topped $3 trillion from this month's lows, amid hopes that the Fed will signal it's ready to start cutting rates. S&P right now at 55.91, up 37, a gain of 0.7%. The Dow up 170, up 0.4, while NASDAQ is up 160, a gain there of 0.9%. 10-year 3.86% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.05%. Spot gold down 0.1%, 25.04 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.8%, 74.50 a barrel. And Bitcoin now at 59,156. Bitcoin down 1.1%. The source tells Bloomberg General Motors is cutting more than 1,000 software engineers as the automaker moves to lean up its software and services organization. More than 600 of those layoffs are said to be in Michigan. General Motors shares, they're up now by 1.1%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P up 39, up 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. Well, let's talk sports, because NFL players are grappling with a complex new reality. They're aware of the money being bet on every catch, run, touchdown, and let's be honest, more. And generally, it's good for the leagues and thus their own financial health. But they're also, if you can even say this about a professional football player, scared on a personal level and generally freaked out about running afoul of league rules. Those words from Jason Kelly, who writes in Bloomberg Business Week all about the relationship that current and former NFL players have with the league embracing sports betting. Jason is chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. His story is featured in the forthcoming issue of the magazine, but read it now on the Bloomberg terminal and at bloomberg.com/businessweek. A football player being scared.
Yeah, wild, right?
Why? I mean, there's signs apparently everywhere, as you write, no betting allowed. In their locker rooms, when they travel, they can't do. What are they scared about specifically?
I think what they're worried about a couple of things. One is that the punishment for running afoul of the rules is harsh. Calvin Ridley is the player that everybody points to. He was playing for the Atlanta Falcons. He was injured. He placed a bet on football while he was not playing and was suspended indefinitely, a suspension that ultimately lasted a year. He got cut from the Falcons. He's now back in the league, but the swiftness and the severity of the punishment really made these guys sit up and think. The other is that because there's now so much money on the line, there are a lot of people who are, shall we say, expressing their opinions to them on social media, in person, about when they don't perform the way that maybe someone bet they would.
Never read the replies, at least.
Yes. Stay away from the comments.
The Washington Commanders running back, I think, shares some good good anecdotes about what people say to him online.
Yeah, absolutely. So Austin Eckler, he is on the cover of the upcoming edition of Bloomberg Business Week. He is a very, well-decorated running back for the Washington Commanders, as you say. He's a really interesting case, in part because a few years ago, he saw a lot of this coming when it came to fantasy football, which was sort of the way that this all started, at least in the United States, where, you draft a team. That a lot of this is actually going on right now. People are getting together. My son was drafting his team with his buddies till 1 a.m. last night. And, it's some friendly wagers that go on. Austin saw that. He actually hosted his own podcast to sort of lean into it. So he started to understand the economics here. Fantasy is a different world, though, because what players can do there is actually spelled out pretty well. There's a cap. They can't make more than $250 on it. So it's really just for fun. But what it did open up for him is this notion of, wow, people are really paying attention in an entirely different way. And that part actually is good for them, as you said in the intro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so why is it good? Like, what good is it doing for the players that now sports betting is legal in more than 30 states in the U.S.?
It's a great question, and the issue for them is that it's essentially the rising tide. So it helps them in a couple ways. One is that the NFL, along with other leagues, has done these very lucrative partnerships with the sports books, with DraftKings and FanDuel and others. And so all of that revenue is ultimately shared with the players. It sort of goes down, collective bargaining sort of dictates that that's happening. So that's one. The second is you just have more people paying attention to the games in a different way. So take Austin Eckler, again, as an example. There are a lot of people who sort of only slightly care who he's playing for. They are either picking him for fantasy or they're betting on his individual performance. So he was playing for the Los Angeles Chargers. Now he's playing for the Washington Commanders. You have a lot of people tuning into games that they might not otherwise be interested in, because if you live in New York, do you really care about the Dallas Green Bay game if you're a fan?
I mean, you do if you put money on it.
Exactly. And so that's the point, is that you're paying attention, you're watching, TV revenue goes up, and revenue accrues to everybody.
Hey, just how strict are these rules for the players? Because one anecdote that one of the players that you and the team profiled in the piece talks about not even being able to play ping pong at an away game, when they're just hanging out in the locker room and betting $5 on it.
Exactly. So this was a really interesting, I did not know this until we worked on this story. So the rules about betting, so you cannot bet, if you're an NFL player, you cannot bet full stop on the NFL, certainly your own team, at all if you're an active player. Can't go there. Mm-hmm. You can bet on other sports, except if you are in a team facility or in any way conducting team business. And so the example that was given was, if you're on essentially a business trip, so you play for the Washington Commanders, you're at an away game in Atlanta, and you're sitting in the Ritz-Carlton, which is probably where you're staying. You're on your bed and you're like, oh, a ping pong game. I just saw this online. I'm going to bet $5 against the rules. You can get fined, you can get suspended. It is absolutely against the rules. So if you're in a team bus, can't bet. So it is very strict. And the reason it's strict is because the NFL has to protect the integrity of the game. Because if there's any sense that the games are fixed or they're in any way compromised, the entire thing falls apart. This is the most lucrative league in the entire world.
What did you learn about the impact on the states in which sports betting is now legalized?
Yeah.
The kinds of tax revenues that they're now generating from this activity?
So revenues certainly are up for the states, and it's one of the reasons, this is a tale as old as time. Lotteries, sports betting, all of that, a lot of the revenue accrues to the states. My colleague Rehan Harmansi, she writes extensively in this cover package about the social impact on this, and I will say it's one thing that the players that I interviewed talked a lot about. They think a lot about this because they have the wherewithal and they have a lot of rules around them to stay away from it, but they say to each other and they say to anyone who will listen, don't do it. Even though it ultimately accrues to them, they have real reservations about this as a practice.
Okay, so let's just talk about that very briefly. The idea of pushback that we could get to, sort of the watershed moment a few years ago where we saw the ability of states on their own to approve sports betting.
Yeah.
Are we going to start seeing pushback?
It is the question. I think the question is going to become, do regulators, do lawmakers, do other people weigh the cost-benefit analysis of the money coming in versus the social impact? There are, studies that point to higher levels of personal bankruptcies. People can really get in trouble. They can get addicted to sports gambling. It is very, very easy to pull up your phone and place a bet, especially where it's legal.
Hey, Jason, on a different subject, just 30 seconds. The Power Players Summit happening here in New York City in just a couple of weeks. Tickets available still?
Yep, tickets available. It's going to be a great program here in the building in New York City, September 5th, right around the U.S. Open, which I know you're going to be involved in, not playing, but covering. Maybe you're playing. I don't know.
Watching
who knows?
and covering.
Who's to say? So we're going to have a lot of really interesting folks on hand. Steve Paliuca, who you know well, owner of the Boston Celtics, is one of the headliners. So more to come. Check it out on our website.
All right, we're looking forward to that. Still waiting on my wild card entry into the U.S. Open, by the way.
I'm pulling for you.
All right, thanks. I appreciate that. Jason Kelly, he's chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. Check out his story. It's in the forthcoming issue of Business Week magazine. You can read it now, though, on the Bloomberg terminal and at bloomberg.com/businessweek. Coming up, One more thing, talk a little bit about expectations and concerns about people losing their jobs. That's next on Business Week.
Company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Advanced Micro Devices has agreed to buy server maker ZT Systems in a cash and stock deal valued at $4.9 billion, adding a data center technology that will bolster its efforts to challenge NVIDIA. ZT Systems, based in Secaucus, New Jersey, will become part of AMD's Data Center Solutions business group. AMD will retain the business's design and customer teams and will look to sell the manufacturing division. Advanced Micro Devices up now by 3.9%. After the close of trading today, we will be hearing from Palo Alto Networks. Its shares have been on a tear over the last 2 weeks, boosted by strong results from a pair of cybersecurity peers and a broader-based rebound by equity markets. Palo Alto up now by 2.5%, but in order to keep the rally going, the company will need to show investors that it does expect a steady demand and that it has managed to scoop up new customers in the wake of CrowdStrike's July outage. The Circle K operator Alimentation Couche-Tard has made an offer to take over much larger rival and 7-Eleven owner 7 & I Holdings in what would be the biggest foreign takeover of a Japanese company. A merger would create the world's top operator of roughly 100,000 convenience stores. ADRs of Alimentation Couche-Tard down now by 1.6%. Billionaire Carl Icahn and his investment firm have agreed to pay $2 million to settle with the Securities and Exchange Commission after an investigation by the regulator. IEP shares, right now, they are down by 4.8%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletin. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. The race for the White House is about to reach a fever pitch this week. Vice President Kamala Harris and Republican nominee Donald Trump battling for momentum and attention around the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Harris is heading into the DNC 4 points ahead of Trump in the latest ABC News Washington Post Ipsos poll, but 9 points behind him on the economy. Isaac Boltansky is Director of Policy Research at BTIG.
What I'm going to be watching this week in Chicago is how much does the Harris campaign try to focus the election on other issues where she is the clear leader, things like healthcare, like abortion, like the senior services issues. Those are all areas where she has clear leads. And I think that's why you're going to hear a whole lot about the care economy over the next 4 days in Chicago.
Isaac Boltansky with BTIG was a guest on Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Manus Cranny. Groundbreaking TV talk show host Phil Donahue has died. His family says he died last night after a long illness. He was at home, surrounded by his sister, children, grandchildren, and his wife of 44 years, Marlo Thomas. 3 months before his death, Donahue was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Biden. Phil Donahue was 88 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Emily Graffeo and Tim Stenivek.
Hey, Amy, thanks so much for that update. Do appreciate it. Well, for our one more thing this afternoon, we're going to draw our attention to one of the most read stories just in the last couple of hours on the Bloomberg terminal by Alex Tanzi, who writes that the share of people who think they're likely to be unemployed in the next 4 months reached a record high in a Federal Reserve Bank of New York survey of consumer expectations. It dates all the way back to 2014, Emily.
Of course, this is coming as everyone from Federal Reserve officials to investors are trying to figure out just what the labor market is telling us right now about the broader economy. Are we heading into a recession? Are we going to get a soft landing? This survey, it seemed like the data was kind of mixed because although we had a record share of people saying that they expect to lose their job, we also had a rising number of consumers who expect to receive a job offer in the next months compared with a year. So I don't know, Tim.
Well, the reason we like to understand sentiment around this is because if somebody's expecting to lose their job, what are they going to do, right? They're going to pull back on spending. And what happens when they pull back on spending? Well, it becomes kind of this, exactly. It becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's certainly of note to economists, to investors who are watching surveys such as these. But as you mentioned, kind of mixed numbers that we saw.
Yeah, it was interesting actually learning about how they conduct this. Every 4 months, the New York Fed asks about 1,000 people about their job situation and outlook. So it's not that many people, but still, again, an important signal.
Yeah, the July survey found that 4.4% of respondents expect to lose their jobs in the next 4 months. It's the highest on record, but the share remains smaller than those who anticipate they'll move to a new employer. As you were talking about, that rose to 11.6%. It highlights increased turnover. The rate of transitioning to a different employer rose 7.1%. That's the highest reading since the survey started. And then the share of people who had a job 4 months ago and are still with the same employer was at a record low of 88%. So there's also some movement happening there, which I guess is also a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, if workers think that they can get a new job easily, then I guess that would point to a strengthening labor market.
And maybe when they get that new job, they're going and getting a higher salary too.
Right, they're asking for more pay.
Hey, that's going to do it for Bloomberg Business Week, at least on TV. If you're staying with us on radio, we got a great program coming up, including a preview of Palo Alto Networks, plus talking about today's big take, a must-read about how Wells Fargo watched, and JP Morgan did as well, as a con man stole a widow's savings. If you're sticking on TV, the close, that's up next. This is Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday, August 19th, 2024. I'm Tim Stenivek, and that is Emily Griffeo. She's in for Carol Masser, who is out this afternoon having some well-deserved time off. Emily, we're seeing green across the screen right now.
This is the 8th straight day of gains for the S&P 500, the best winning streak for the equity benchmark for all of 2024, which is incredible considering where we were just a few days ago. I guess that really speaks to the rebound.
Yeah, it certainly does. Earnings still coming.
They're still going on.
We got NVIDIA next week, this week, and today, Palo Alto Networks. We're going to have Carmen Reinecke join us in just a few minutes talking about what to keep an eye on for Palo Alto Networks. Then I know a story that is certainly on your radar. You couldn't stop talking about it this morning, about JP Morgan and Wells Fargo watching as a con men stole a widow's saving.
Yeah.
This is a gripping read.
It was really incredible. It was heartbreaking, and unfortunately speaks to a trend that's becoming more common as older Americans take more and more share of the wealth in America. We're seeing financial crimes and scams actually increase by a lot. So I'm excited to talk about that.
About a lot of people who I know over the age of 60 who I'm going to be sending this story to. We're also going to be checking in with Avi Hassan over in Tel Aviv. He's CEO of Startup Nation Central. And then a little later in the program, Mark Gonglaw from Bloomberg Opinion is going to be joining us to talk a little bit about, on the eve, well, I guess it's not even the eve of the Democratic National Convention, as the Democratic National Convention continues, are we going to hear Harris actually talk about climate change? All that and more on Bloomberg Business Week over the next couple of hours. First up, though, a check on the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Peller.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. We got 58 minutes to go until that closing bell clangs on Wall Street. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ at or near session highs right now. Stocks keep pushing higher, adding to a rally that's already topped $3 trillion from this month's lows, amid hopes that the Fed will signal it is ready to start cutting rates. S&P now at 55.91. It is up 36 points, a gain right now of 0.7%. The Dow up 177, up 0.4%, and NASDAQ up 160, a gain of 0.9%. 10-year 3.86% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.06%. Gold down 0.1%, 25.04 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.8%, 74.48 for a barrel of WTI. Well, as we have been mentioning, Wall Street looking ahead to Friday's Jackson Hole speech from Fed Chair Jay Powell. Lindsay Pieggs is chief economist at Stifel Nicolaus.
We will want to hear from Chairman Powell and how he's interpreting the data and whether we'll start to get some smoke signals on the potential rate cut in September. Certainly, some of the committee members have been coming out and some of the governors have been coming out suggesting that we could start to see the cutting cycle in September, which we do believe will start.
All right, that is Nadia Lovell of UBS. So again, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all higher. S&P right now up 37, a gain of 0.7%. Briefly, sources tell Bloomberg Paramount Global, which has agreed to merge with David Ellison's Skydance Media, is likely to extend the deadline for rival takeover bids if Edgar Bronfman Jr. makes an offer for the company before Wednesday night. Those are our top business stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. As we mentioned, earnings season not over, not even close to over when you got NVIDIA next week. But we're talking about Palo Alto Networks. It's set to report earnings after the bell today, and shares the company over the last couple of weeks, they've just been on a tear. They've been boosted by strong results from a pair of cybersecurity peers and a broader-based rebound when it comes to equity markets that we have been talking about all day. We got Carmen Reinecke joining us. She's Bloomberg News equities reporter. She joins us from New York City. Carmen, what do we need to keep an eye on when Palo Alto Networks crosses today, expected at about 4:05 Wall Street time?
Yeah, well, as you said, Tim, it's really all about sort of the guidance going forward here. So Palo Alto shares have really been on a tear, and 16% rally since August 5th has actually brought them sort of back into the green for the year. They really struggled before then. They had a record drop in February after giving a not so rosy guidance going forward for cybersecurity sales. So what investors are really looking for is, are they going to see more clients buying cybersecurity going forward? And are they going to comment on the CrowdStrike outage? Palo Alto Networks is one of the companies that investors thought maybe should be one of the biggest beneficiaries of that issue. And so this is the first time that we're going to really hear from the company about if they're seeing an uptick in sales because of that, or if not. Of course, Wall Street analysts and investors are also going to be looking for what they say about their efforts to move forward through platformization, which is sort of what they call bundling their services. They're sort of switching over to this approach. So there's a lot that investors will be keeping an eye on and hoping to see that this rally continue.
For those of us who are not cybersecurity experts, can you give us a sense of what exactly is Palo Alto Networks? What is their product? Who are their customers? And then when you're looking in this earnings report, how would you see a migration of customers from CrowdStrike that have moved over to Palo Alto? What would that show up as?
So I actually don't know that we will be seeing much in this report because remember this outage really just happened. So again, it's kind of more about the guidance. If they say that they're starting to see an uptick in sales, they're starting to see these big clients. And to answer sort of the question there, their clients are, big tech companies, some of the biggest companies, the mega cap tech names. And I mean, also, kind of could run the gamut of anyone that is looking for, cybersecurity protection right now, which, I mean, think about all the companies that have had different hacks in the last year. It's been healthcare, financial services, all of those kinds of companies work with places like Palo Alto Networks. So it's similar to CrowdStrike. It's looking to sort of bundle its services more going forward. And what investors will really be looking for is commentary there on if they're seeing an uptick, or actually what I've heard from some investors is there is a little bit of a fear that the CrowdStrike outage could actually hurt. Like maybe people are sort of pulling back and they're not sure where they want to go next for their cybersecurity coverage.
Hey, Carmen, before we let you go, back in November, I remember after the company reported, we saw a wild move down. It fell by 29% after the company reported earnings. The concern was that budgets had shifted from software as a service companies and cybersecurity to investing in AI, and Palo Alto Networks was on the receiving end of some of that shift in spending. How should we sort of watch for a big move after today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Palo Alto is one of the companies that's had sort of the most interesting earnings reports and swings around them. I mean, they had that record drop. They had the quarter in February. They also had a report last year that came on a Friday, which really spooked investors. Everyone thought, oh, maybe there would be bad news. It ended up to just be sort of a scheduling conflict. It's definitely one to watch. The shift in spend to AI is a big one. I think that there's a lot of sort of froth that could be up for this company in the short term. But the one thing that I do hear time and time again from investors, and I think what the longer term people are really waiting for, is this idea that, cyber attacks are only getting more prevalent. They're getting more sophisticated, and Palo Alto Networks is one of the companies really seen on the forefront of that. So kind of a short term and a long term story there.
Carmen, appreciate you joining us. Always appreciate you joining us. You've certainly been busy when it comes to writing about these companies that are reporting. Check out Carmen's story and more on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com. Carmen Reinecke, Bloomberg News equities reporter, joining us from New York City. And as I mentioned, we are expecting Palo Alto Networks to cross just after 4 o'clock. We'll bring those numbers to you just as we get them. Okay, so that's the micro. That's a company that we're watching closely. Now to one of today's most read stories on the Bloomberg Terminal. That's
our Bloomberg Big Take, which tells the story of Annette Manis, an 85-year-old widow who saw her life savings wiped away to con artists impersonating JP Morgan's fraud department. Over months of an elaborate scam, they tricked her into handing them about $1.4 million. And her experience is unfortunately growing more common as criminals target the record wealth controlled by elderly Americans. Now, this Big Take is by a handful of Bloomberg News reporters, including Tom Schoenberg and Denise Liu, and also Ann Choi and Paige Smith, who join us both now in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Great story to both of you guys. So, Paige, let's start with you. How did the scammers target Manus into handing over her hard-earned money?
That is a great question. And as you said, it's increasingly more and more common as older Americans sort of have this record wealth that they haven't seen before. A lot of that has to do with shifts in how you and I think about retirement, for example, and how, older family members think about retirement. We sort of have the keys to a lot of our savings, whereas that wasn't the case previously. A lot of our employers had the keys, for example. Now we have more money in defined contribution plans and sort of have the responsibility is on consumers to, manage their own savings. Couple that with housing the value of homes that have shot up over the past several decades. And, you sort of have these older Americans that are just sitting on these piles of wealth, and that makes them really, really rich targets for scammers. And that is what happened to Annette.
And she's by no means a wealthy person in the sense of worked some job where she was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars a year. And she just did an incredible job saving as a single mother for much of her life.
Right. Annette was a former social worker for the New York State. Like you said, she was a widow. She rarely spent any money. She didn't own a passport when she went on work trips. She packed her own lunches so she could save the stipend. So it's particularly unusual that her bank of decades, JP Morgan and Chase, when her unusual banking activity started, when she would withdraw thousands of dollars in cash over a week, it begs the questions what responsibilities banks have in protecting their customers. Because like you said, more and more scammers will be targeting the elderly.
Okay, I want to get to the responsibility of the banks in just a minute. But before we do that, Paige, take us through. She's sitting there. She gets a phone call. She hangs up on the phone call. The way this started, because I think it's a really important warning sign in this day and age when people don't know who's on the other end of that phone line.
She, like you said, Annette received these multiple phone calls from these scammers, and they convinced her. She genuinely believed that she was working with the fraud department at JP Morgan and with U.S. agents. They even, down the line, even told her the name of a target, for example, that had, that they were presumably she was, quote unquote, helping them catch. So it really became, it in her mind, she was trying to help. And it was she truly believed that she was trying to help these folks. As Anne said, she had this career where she was helping people for decades, so she really fell for it. And I do think it's a very cautionary tale. I mean, my grandparents fell for a scam. They almost bought $10,000 in Home Depot gift cards. It's sort of one of those things that, like, this happens to more people than you think. And some of the reactions we've seen are, oh, how could this person be so silly, or how could they fall for it? And I think it's really important to, tell loved ones, tell friends, tell family that, you also could fall for scams like this.
I am targeted legitimately every day.
Yes, yes.
No question. Like, I get text messages. I got a text message last night that said, "Are you back from your trip yet?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I did just get back from a trip.
Wow.
Should I wasn't like, I'm going to reply, but, they send that to enough people. Mm-hmm. I've gotten calls from Amazon or purporting to be Amazon, Emily. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This stuff is everywhere. And I'm not old yet.
Well,
that's what. I'm not an older American yet. I should point out.
When you read through the story, it details how she then went on to withdraw money. So this was not a story about a scammer stealing her credit card and, spending wild amounts of money. This is a story about her believing that she was supposed to be withdrawing this money. So I'm curious why these large transactions or these large withdrawals didn't set off, cause for concern on the banking side.
The customer's rights to their deposit is a pretty sacred one, right? It's more often than not, banks are not going to say, no, you can't access your own money. Our reporting shows that there is some responsibility for banks to flag the Treasury when large amount of cash exceeding $10,000. If that happens, they're supposed to file these reports. but that is primarily to target money laundering. It's not really set up to stop scams. So this particular case, we were able to see how banks handle these requests differently. We see a regional lender pretty quickly make a guess, educated guess that something fishy is going on. So blocks her wire transfers and closes the account. Whereas JP Morgan, again, her bank of many years, who knew her spending pattern, who the branch employees knew her by face, watched it happen.
What did JP Morgan say when contacted by you and the team, Paige, about the account?
You know, I think that instead of focusing in on individual banks as well, I think it's important to note that all of the banks responded in some regard. It's just how they sort of responded. And to put kind of a finer point on what Anne was saying in terms of liability and obligation that banks have when this happens, when you're a huge bank, a global institution like JP Morgan, your responsibility is to catch the worst of the worst actors.
Yeah.
And it's all about volume. It's much less about individual consumer experience.
I do want to point out what they did say in the piece, quote, "We're sorry Miss Maines fell victim to a highly sophisticated scam. The company noted that the con artists coached her into making statements that misled bank employees. We are helping law enforcement with their investigation, and we continue to educate our customers about scams and how to avoid them."
Did she get any of the money back?
For her credit card bills, because scammers were able to open accounts and run credit card bills, Chase did forgive some of her debt as well as Capital One, but bulk of her loss was cash, and so far she hasn't been able to recoup any of her losses.
Paige, you mentioned that you have sort of a personal connection to a scam, your grandparents. What is the big takeaway for the two of you when it comes to sort of understanding the world we live in and what we should be telling our friends and family about how to avoid becoming victims here?
I think part of it as well is the first call you should make, especially if it's a family member who thinks that another family member is in trouble. Maybe directly contact that family member to make sure they're not. I think that, that's one way to protect ourselves against it. But obviously in a situation like this, that wasn't plausible. But, one of the actions that Annette's son, Peter, took pretty immediately after he learned of the scam was to call JP Morgan and check if there were actually employees of the name that had the names of the people who had been contacting Annette. And in fact, they, of course, were not employees of the bank. So I think it's just important to check in with your loved ones, see how they're doing, see where they are in their finances, if they think they are, being scammed or if something is phishing, just to keep that dialogue.
And I want to give you the last word. We have 20 seconds left. Your biggest takeaway for our listeners and viewers.
Everyone is at risk of being a victim to these type of crimes. I think being able to stay vigilant, both in terms of, like Paige said, being close to your family members, but also being able to discuss these financial matters and give grace to the person that this is not their fault, that there's a way forward.
Ann Choi and Paige Smith here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. The Big Take, check it out at bloomberg.com/thebigtake, and always, of course, on the Bloomberg terminal. This is Business Week.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks advancing. The S&P very close to session highs right now. 38-point advance. The S&P now at 55.92. That is a gain of 0.7%. Dow Jones Industrial Average higher now by 175 points, up 0.4%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 167, up 1%. Nasdaq 100 Index up 0.9%, with a 10-year that's now at 3.86%. The 2-year 4.06%. Gold lower a little change, down 0.1%, 25.04 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 3.1%, 74.29 a barrel. It is a key week for markets. On Friday, Fed Chair Jay Powell is expected to give fresh insights on monetary policy at the central bank's annual confab in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. We asked Lori Calvasina, head of U.S. equity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, on what she will be listening for.
I think at this point we need to hear more of the same. I would assume that the commentary is going to be carefully tailored to match what's been said previously. But as always, we're going to have to tune in and see.
Lori Calvasina of RBC Capital Markets. So again, recapping, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing. S&P right now up 38, a gain of 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie. Really do appreciate it. Well, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted a ceasefire proposal to halt the war in Gaza, and the next step is for Hamas to say yes, as the Biden administration looked to bring an end to the 10-month conflict at last. Blinken is on his 9th trip to the region since Hamas attacked southern Israel back on October 7th and called the proposed accord, quote, a bridging agreement, and acknowledged that not everything is spelled out in detail, but it does build on a proposal that President Joe Biden put forward in late May, which both sides had balked at. The reason I'm talking about this is because we are going right to Tel Aviv to speak with Avi Hassan, who's CEO of Startup Nation Central. It's a nonprofit that works, in its own words, to promote the Israeli innovation ecosystem around the world. Avi's also Israel's former chief scientist of the Ministry of Economy and the founding chairman of the Israel Innovation Authority. Avi, I want to get your comments on the latest out of that we just heard from Antony Blinken, but also taking a step back, how things have shifted in your role post-October 7th. So first on the breaking news.
Yeah, so obviously, we'll look forward, hopefully, to have a success of these negotiations that brings the hostages home and really brings us closer to a ceasefire. So we're truly grateful for the involvement of the U.S. administration and the support that it has been showing. And hopefully this pressure will also work well on the other side, which still has to concede to the proposed deal. If that happens, then, we will start thinking about the day after. There's a lot to do, and innovation is certainly going to play a big part also in that recovery.
How has Israel's economy responded over the last few months to the threat of a potential attack from Hamas?
Yeah, so we're very lucky, Emily, that the Israeli economy actually came into this war in a very, very strong position. If we look into the macro indicator, in the past 5 years or so, we've seen a tremendous growth of Israel's GDP, a very, very low debt to GDP compared to other countries, very low unemployment, very managed inflation, basically thanks to the strength of the high-tech sector. And remarkably, when we look on the macro indicator 10 months after the horrible day of October 7th, while we do see drop and some slowness in the markets, the resilience of the Israeli economy as a whole, and specifically of the high-tech sector, has been astounding. And by the way, Israel's high-tech is the country's business plan. 20% of our GDP comes from high-tech.
So, Avi, we get great. One of the things that I love about our program is we get great feedback and questions from members of our audience who are listening and watching around the world. Our producer is sending me a question from one of the members of our audience asking a really important one, I think. Have you seen the business community put pressure on the Israeli government to end the war?
I think, war is not good for business. It adds uncertainty, not to talk about the direct impact of having, at the height, it was about 10% of the high-tech workforce that had been enlisted to active reserve duty. You add to that, the problems with air travel into Israel and so on, and it's obvious that, certainly from an economic point of view as well as from a humanitarian one, ending this war and moving into, back to business in many aspects is something that the business community aspires. And as such, yes, of course, they've been vocal with the government to push that forward. And unfortunately, Tim, for war, you don't necessarily need both sides participating. So both sides need to agree really on, finishing this round of conflict and moving forward. I have to say that if I need to choose one word that will characterize what the Israeli business community and high-tech specifically has shown, it will be resilience. Because if we just look at the numbers and just look at the output coming out of that sector, the over $5 billion raised by Israeli startups in the first half of 2023, making it very, very similar to the U.S. trends. Really putting that Israeli factor to a minimum, showing that resilience, showing that spirit, which in many aspects characterize the Israeli innovators, and is probably the main reason why 450 multinational companies have chosen to set up their innovation centers in here and have been growing throughout the 6 months, even due to the war taking place.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I'll repeat that stat because you had sent it over to us in your notes. Private funding in the first half of 2024 saw a 31% increase amounting to $5.1 billion US dollars. Talk a little bit about where that funding is going, what kinds of startups specifically are seeing the most investment.
Yes, Israel is a home to over 7,500 startups who really lead the world in terms of startups, entrepreneurs, venture firms, who were called the Startup Nation for a reason. If we try to look into the sectors that have drawn most of the investment in the first half of 2024, cybersecurity certainly stands out. And when it comes to cybersecurity, Israel is truly a superpower, punching way above our weights. There's a lot happening in the cybersecurity sector in the world. And most of what we've seen in Israel is just a reflection of that. There's an arms race of the big players within cybersecurity, the Palo Altos, the CrowdStrikes, the Zscalers, the Ciscos, and the likes. That has caused a lot of M&A to take place. And if you're trying to look for innovation, certainly in this specific sector, Israel is one of the places where you will be doing that. And this is why we saw a lot of investment flowing in. To mention just one company, Wiz, W-I-Z, raised $1 billion in a signal round, still a private company, but certainly one that is, doing a lot of great things. But we've seen over 320 rounds as part of that number that you mentioned, and not just in cyber. So Israel really has a diversified ecosystem. And at the end of the day, what people are looking for, when I talk to either the CEOs of the large companies, the Jensen Huang, the Pat Gelsingers, the Safakats, it's mostly about the spirit and the culture. There are a lot of places in the world where innovation takes place, but we do it slightly different. Sometimes we like to call it impatient innovation. And I know that patience is a virtue, and Israelis, I guess, are notoriously an impatient bunch of people. But if you think about it, when it comes to innovation and the problems we all, societies and economies, are coping with, we need a little bit of that healthy disregard for protocol. We need a little bit of that boldness, scrappiness, just jumping into action. That's very Israeli. We've seen that in the war. I think that's one of the reasons why civil society and private sector have self-mobilized, sometimes to, create solutions that, are either complementary to the government or instead of the government. And it's that spirit of innovation that attracts the world's best investors and really the CEOs of the greatest companies to both invest in Israeli companies and acquire Israeli companies. So we've seen a lot of M&A activity in the first 6 months, which again, if you think about it, during wartime is not intuitive.
Avi, I know that Israel's famous for certain startups, including Waze that Google bought years ago, Mobileye and Intel, of course, but also cybersecurity, as you mentioned. help us move this forward a little bit, just in the last 45 seconds that we have with you. What's sort of the next frontier of innovation that you see emerging from Israel?
Certainly when we see the next upcoming sectors, they really refer to the global challenges that we all cope with, as human beings. So there are 3 times more health tech startups in Israel than cybersecurity startups in Israel. There are about 1,000 startups dealing with sustainability, energy, climate, and so on. And if you think about the utility technology, AI is driving all of this change. So either as platform horizontal solutions or applied in vertical solutions from agri-tech and food tech to health that we mentioned before, AI is driving this forward. And Israel, is right there at the forward, taking advantage of a well-developed ecosystem that has matured in the past 30 years to have that fountain of innovation continuing regardless of crisis. I'm pretty optimistic that after we finish this war, hopefully sooner rather than later, we will see a baby boom or startup boom, actually, bringing, both innovation that was relevant and put into test during this conflict, but also just bold new ideas taken by Israel's entrepreneurs into the world.
Avi, we got to leave it there. Avi, CEO of Startup Nation Central in Tel Aviv. Let's get to world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. Kamala Harris is heading into the DNC 4 points ahead of former President Donald Trump in the latest ABC News Washington Post Ipsos poll, but 9 points behind him on the economy. Isaac Boltansky is Director of Policy Research at BTIG.
What I'm going to be watching this week in Chicago is how much does the Harris campaign try to focus the election on other issues where she is the clear leader, things like healthcare, like abortion, like the senior services issues. Those are all areas where she has clear leads. And I think that's why you're going to hear a whole lot about the care economy over the next 4 days in Chicago.
Isaac Boltansky with BTIG was a guest on Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Manus Cranny. Harris rolled out an economic policy agenda late last week, and she did it strategically. That's according to Brett Bruen, who served in the Obama White House and is now president of Global Situation Room.
She wanted to put out not a complex theory, but some very concrete pieces that voters, especially voters in those battleground states, can relate to. They can relate to a child tax credit. They can relate to the price gouging issue.
Brett Bruen with Global Situation Room. The DA in former President Trump's hush money case is letting a New York judge decide if sentencing should be delayed. This after the Supreme Court ruled the presidents have some immunity from prosecution. Trump was found guilty in May of concealing payments to porn star Stormy Daniels prior to the 2016 election. Talk show host pioneer Phil Donahue has died. The cause of death not immediately disclosed, but his family did say he had been suffering from a long illness. His nationally syndicated talk show was a ratings hit and the first such talk show where the host interacted with the studio audience. Phil Donahue was 88 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks keep pushing higher. It is an update for the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, and the Russell 2000. Let's head right over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. And here she is, Felice Morantz.
Good afternoon, Charlie. Stocks climbed throughout the day as an optimistic narrative took hold. The S&P 500 climbed for an eighth day, the longest winning streak this year. Goldman cut its recession probability to 20% and said reports of concern over the U.S. consumer were greatly exaggerated. And the Dow up about 0.4%, S&P 500 up 0.7%, NASDAQ 100 up about 1%, with the U.S. 10-year yield at 3.86%. All 11 main S&P 500 sectors trading in the green, led by communications and consumer discretionary. Some of the top gainers, Albemarle, Moderna, and McDonald's. NVIDIA rallied around 3.5%. HP Inc. and Starbucks were among the worst performers. Deal news picked up with AMD agreeing to buy server maker ZT Systems in a transaction valued at $4.9 billion. Target and TJX are among major retail names reporting this week. In other news, oil sank around 3%, with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken saying Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted a ceasefire proposal for Gaza. Live from the First Word breaking news desk, I'm Felice Morantz. Charlie?
All right, we thank you very much, Felice. And to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg-type squawk, SQUA, on your Bloomberg terminal. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
And it's time for the Drive to the Close. We're joined today with Dan Skelly, head of Wealth Management Research and Strategy Team at Morgan Stanley. He joins us on Zoom from New York City. Dan, we've been talking all day about how this is the 8th straight day of gains for the S&P 500, the largest or the biggest winning streak of 2024. What do you think is driving this rebound here in the equity market?
Thanks for having me, Emily. And look, I think the last week of gains, following what had been obviously a week or so or a couple weeks of weakness, reminds me that the economy and company fundamentals tend to move more like a cruise liner, whereas stock prices tend to zip around more like a speedboat. And frankly, I think when you think about that setup related to the August period where liquidity tends to wane anyway, the unwind of the Japanese yen carry train, as we all know, has been talked about extensively. I think you just ran into a situation where market liquidity conditions, technicals, and some rotation out of the prior leadership into new pockets of the market were all part and parcel related to what drove the market.
What do you say to those folks out there, Dan, who say, all right, I want to buy stocks, I want to buy large cap equities, but I'm a little concerned that the S&P 500 is looking a little frothy right now?
So I've been listening to people describe the S&P as frothy for a year. And I think, frankly, when you think about what had driven that valuation premium, as you know, it was the third of the market that was technology-based that got caught up with the AI excitement, but frankly and quite practically had very strong earnings revisions. And so, look, what I would say is, given the reality around the Fed cutting amid a positive economy has started to take hold more ingrained in investors' minds, given the S&P 493 earnings are improving, and it's not just a Magnificent Seven earnings story anymore, and given that the phase of the suspension of disbelief around AI return and the capital spending, tremendous capital spending that's gone into that particular theme is now starting to elicit more scrutiny from the markets, I think, to your question, the opportunity set outside of the Magnificent Seven, outside of the index level, is about as strong as it has been over the last year.
So where exactly are you seeing those opportunities? Is it, going smaller down the market cap spectrum, or just broadening out on a sector level, but still remaining in large cap?
So that's an excellent question. I would say it's more of the latter. So when you look at the vicious rally in small caps a month ago, we were actually saying to fade that, because even though rates are going to come down, per my comments earlier, the resting heart rate of inflation and the cost of capital in this cycle will simply be higher than it was versus the post-08 cycle. Thus, you need better financially positioned equity exposure in large cap versus small. And second, while none of us really know ultimately when AI is going to start to show up in large cap companies' productivity and earnings streams, what we, I think, all could argue is that it's more likely than not that quality large cap names with cash flow will participate in the investment cycle around AI, whereas small caps that don't have that same cash flow likely will not. So to answer your question, we are encouraging investors today to look outside of the Magnificent Seven into more large cap quality value ideas, like financials, like industrials, in some cases like healthcare. We also, Emily, are telling investors and clients to look outside the US. And I'll give a nod to Lisa Shallett, our CIO, a week ago, who said to buy Japan after what had been obviously a fairly volatile period for Japanese stocks. And that call has proven to be fairly prescient so far.
Hey, Dan, Democratic National Convention kicks off. Politics is front and center for us for the next 80 days or so. How are you thinking about political risk when it comes to your portfolio, and what you're thinking about the composition, not just of who's in the White House come January 2025, but who are in the halls of Congress too?
So I joked with John and Lisa when I was on your peers' studio, TV studio, about 6 weeks ago that we're basically getting that question on the hour. So we're pretty versed in our response. But look, it's all jokes aside. It always plays a factor in markets in the short run, right? Whether or not certain policies get enacted or sentiment around certain politicians gets reflected in markets, it has a short run effect. Having said that, looking at decades and decades of data, I think it's quite evident that, as we always say, the business cycle and the profit cycle oftentimes tends to supersede any 1 year, 1 month political impact. So having said all of that, you asked clearly an important question around how are we thinking about this election. And look, what we would argue is if you do see a potential red sweep where the odds were frankly higher a month ago than they are today, given changes in the Democratic ticket lineup. But if you were to see that red sweep, that's where we see the widest band of outcomes in terms of maybe some positives related to deregulation, but maybe some uncertainties related to tariff, trade, and immigration policy, which could disrupt the Goldilocks disinflation thesis. And so that's where you see the widest bands of market and economic impact. On the other hand, in the blue sweep scenario, we liken that to, frankly, more of the same, more of the status quo. Okay. So that's how we are starting to think tactically about those two different outcomes. Very last thing I would say is I think it's been particularly notable that long rates have been coming down ever since the June 27th debate outcome. And as we all know, following that outcome, the red sweep odds went up, but rates went down. So quite obviously, the markets are paying attention to something else, which is a little bit of mixed economic data, but more certainty around the path of disinflation. So I have found that rates vis-a-vis politics and betting odds, betting markets to be fairly notable.
All right, well, we're going to have to get you back on before November for an update on how things may have shifted, at least according to polling. Dan Skelly, love it when you join us, head of wealth management research and strategy team over at Morgan Stanley, joining us from New York City. We are just about 10 minutes away from the close of U.S. equity trading. NASDAQ higher by close to a percentage point, the S&P 500 up 0.7. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Harley-Davidson is dropping several diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives after weeks of sustained pressure from an anti-DEI crusader. The Milwaukee-based company said today it no longer has minority-owned supplier spending goals. It will drop socially motivated training for employees and will make other changes to back away from diversity programs. Harley-Davidson shares little change right now, up less than 0.1%. Palo Alto Networks will be among the names reporting today after the close of trading. Its shares have been on a tear over the last 2 weeks, boosted by strong results from a pair of cybersecurity peers and a broader-based rebound by equity markets. Palo Alto up now by 2.6%. Advanced Micro Devices buying server maker ZT Systems in a cash and stock transaction valued at $4.9 billion, adding data center technology. And right now we've got Advanced Micro Devices shares. They are trading higher. AMD now up by just about 4.3%. Circle K operator Alimentation Couche-Tard has made a proposal to take over much larger rival and 7-Eleven owner 7 & I Holdings. ADRs of Alimentation Couche-Tard, they're down today by 2.1%. Sources tell Bloomberg Paramount Global, which has agreed to merge with David Ellison's Skydance Media, is likely to extend a deadline for rival takeover bids if Edgar Bronfman Jr. makes an offer for the company before Wednesday night. Paramount Global shares, they're advancing now. Paramount up by just about 0.9%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stennebeck on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. We're about 5 minutes from the close of trading, and as we just heard from Charlie Pellet, we got green across the screen. In fact, the NASDAQ now higher by 1.3%. The S&P 500 up by 0.9%, while the Dow higher by 0.5 percentage point. Emily, I want to talk a little bit more about this story that Charlie mentioned during his newscast just now.
This is about Harley-Davidson dropping several diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, initiatives after weeks of sustained pressure from an anti-DEI crusader on mostly social media. This is activist Robbie Starbuck, and he was kind of going on his social media calling out woke corporations, and now we're seeing companies respond to this activist.
Yeah, not just Harley-Davidson. The company joining Tractor Supply, Deere, and Polaris in scaling back or changing DEI policies following that campaign by activist Robbie Starbuck. For its part, Harley-Davidson saying that it no longer has minority-owned supplier spending goals. It'll drop socially motivated training for employees and make other changes to back away from diversity programs. The company also said it hasn't operated a corporate DEI function since April, it said in a statement posted to the social media platform X.
It also said that it will no longer participate in an annual rating of LGBTQ acceptance conducted by the Human Rights Campaign, and it will reorganize employee resource groups to focus solely on business development, mentoring, and training. Their actual statement said that they remain committed to listening to all members of our community. They're saddened by the negativity on social media over the last few weeks, designed to divide the Harley-Davidson community.
Yeah, Robbie Starbuck spoke to our Bloomberg News team and said, quote, "It's time to get rid of these policies and bring back a sense of neutrality and sanity in corporate America." He credited the spread of posts on social media, particularly from Harley influencers, for the company's move. He said, quote, "We've kind of reached critical mass."
What were the posts? I'm curious.
I haven't seen the
I gotta
posts.
check those out.
Yeah, there's some embedded in the story. So check out this story from Jeff Green and more on the Bloomberg terminal. Harley shares were a little changed in the last hour after the company did make this announcement. Speaking of shares, we're seeing stocks close to their best levels of the day, with green across the screen for the Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ. Coming up, we're going to be joined by our Bloomberg TV team for our cross-platform coverage on radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals to count you down to the close. Bloomberg's The Closing Bell starts now.
Having an awful day. Stick with us. Full market coverage continuing right here on Bloomberg.
The Closing Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close, starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostic here alongside Scarlett Fu. Alex still, I think, paddling her way down the Taconic State Parkway somewhere. But our global simulcast must go on here. Carol Massar out as well. Tim Stenovic is here. Emily Grafeo stepping in for Carol. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, radio, television, and our partnership with YouTube, Tim.
Yeah, day of a lot of green up there. The S&P 500 up right now for an 8th day in a row. Stocks are close to their best levels of the day. It's kind of the best winning streak, not even kind of, it is the best winning streak for the S&P 500 so far this year, Emily, a far cry from 2 weeks ago.
Exactly, and you're seeing those volatility markets drop. The VIX now down almost 2% today, like you said, a far cry from just 2 weeks ago where the S&P was down 3% on a day.
Yeah, but this is an August Monday. There's not a whole lot of volume. In the S&P 500, for instance, volume is down about 30% from the 20-day average. And aside from Jay Powell on Friday, there's a lot of people just kind of waiting, marking time until they hear from Powell.
Well, you're still seeing a lot of activity in the space here. Of course, there's a lot of people who stay invested in what are they bidding up, a lot of biotech, a lot of financial stocks, and, well, quite frankly, a lot of everything. I mean, it was something like 400-plus stocks in the S&P 500. We're getting bids today, Tim.
Yeah, I feel bad for anyone who has to do decliners today. That's why I ended up taking the gainers.
Is that you?
No, that would be Emily. Yeah. When Carol's out, I get to do whatever I want, Romaine, when Carol's not here. So.
Do you? Yeah, I know the feeling.
Took the gainers.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we do have green across the screen here for the major U.S. indices, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average up more than 200 points, or about 0.6% as we get the closing bells here in New York. A low volume day to be sure, but the S&P 500 continues to power on for an 8th straight session, up more than 50 points, or about 1% on the day as it tries to creep back towards that record high, reclaiming 5,600 here on the day. That's the main headline across the Bloomberg terminal. The NASDAQ composite up about 1.4% on the day. Similar moves on the NASDAQ 100, and the Russell 2000 trying to keep pace, up about 26 points on the day, or 1.2%.
Yeah, we're only about 1% off of those all-time highs for the S&P 500. As far as peeling back the layers of the S&P 500 today, 415 stocks did move higher. Only 84 stocks did move lower today.
It is pretty remarkable how broad-based this advance is. You look at the 11 sector groups in the S&P 500, and it's pretty much all green. In fact, if you break it down into 24 industry groups, the only reason you have that slice of red there is perhaps because the tech, hardware, and equipment group is mixed overall, and that's because of losses in HP. But otherwise, it is a sea of green.
All right, well, speaking of a sea of green, I got the gainers for you. I had the easy job today. I do want to start with shares of Advanced Micro Devices. AMD up by 4.5% today. They agreed to buy the server maker ZT Systems. It's a cash and stock transaction valued at just about $5 billion. The company, ZT Systems, that is going to be part of AMD's Data Center Solutions business group. And we don't often see shares of the company doing the acquiring actually move higher, but investors certainly applauded the deal, sending shares higher today by more than 4%. Also, keep an eye on shares of Palo Alto Networks. This is a company that is reporting earnings in the coming minutes. We're going to bring you those numbers as soon as we get them. Shares finishing the day higher by 2.8%. Shares have been on a tear just over the last 2 weeks. We got strong results from some cybersecurity peers, also that broader rebound in equity markets that we've been talking about. The big question is whether or not they've seen an uptick in sales post that CrowdStrike outage. So has CrowdStrike's loss been Palo Alto Networks' gain? Keep an eye on that in commentary as well. And finally, shares of McDonald's finishing in the green today. Evercore ISI analyst David Palmer raised his price target on the company from $300 to $320. Palmer's, quote, increasingly bullish on the business, which has recently seen relative market share trend improvements, Emily.
Can I just add another one to that? Fubo TV up another 18%
that was wild,
today.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, we're actually going to have the CEO on Fubo. This is just me just trying to do a shameless plug, Tim.
You can
Please
do
don't
that,
step
but that
on
was
it.
on Friday's news, right?
That's right, and now we have the CEO today on Monday, Tim, and I'm sure you'll be watching.
No, I'm not saying that the stock moved higher on Friday. I was out Friday, so if I...
It moved up Friday, and it's moved up today.
And it moved up today.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. No, I think it's a great booking. Don't get me wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah, I might walk off set here to go and watch the interview.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
first you have to listen to the
Okay.
decliners, Tim.
I will. I'm sorry. Please.
Way to call the
well,
shots, Emily.
As Scarlett mentioned, HP Inc., one of the only large cap stocks in the red today, falling about 3.5% as Morgan Stanley downgrades the computer hardware firm to equal weight from overweight, citing limited upside to estimates and valuation. Their previous positive stance was based on the view that the market wasn't appreciating a return to personal systems, revenue growth, stable print margins, and accelerating capital returns. This now all looks priced in, according to analyst Eric Woodring. He said overall the risk profile seems balanced for now. I'm also looking at shares of Shake Shack falling as much as 4.5%, along with peers Dutch Bros and Sweetgreen after Piper Sandler cut the stocks to neutral from overweight, tempering its view on the fast casual subsector. Analyst Brian Mullen says he's not negative on the burger chain Shake Shack, but sees the current risk reward as more balanced at current levels. You look at what the stock has done year to date, it's already up 40%. He set a price target, which now implies about a 6.2 increase from the last close for the rest of the year. And finally, I really had to go down the market cap spectrum to find another decliner. So I'm looking at Liquidia. The shares plunged as much as 41%, a record drop to their lowest level since December after the drug makers said the FDA delayed until 2025 the final approval of its Eutrepia inhalation powder to treat adults with pulmonary diseases. Needham called the delay a curveball scenario.
And I'll just add one more decliners too. Shortly in late in the cast session, we saw a big drop in shares of U.S. Steel. That was back on a report by Reuters here, saying that former President Donald Trump, if he were reelected, would try to block the Nippon Steel deal. Let's take a look at the yield space. If you thought the equity action was maybe a little subdued in terms of volume, well, that doesn't even compare to what we saw in the Treasury space. We did see a flattening out of the curve, but you see the numbers on the screen. If you're in your car right now, nothing really to look at. We're basically talking about moves of about 1 basis point up or down here on the day, as a lot of people, of course, waiting to get a little more clarity out of the economic data this week and Jay Powell's speech on Friday.
Okay, well, before we get to Jay Powell's speech, we're going to get a bit of economic data. One piece of economic news that caught our eye today is the results of a survey from the New York Fed that talks about the share of people who actually think they're likely to be unemployed in the next 4 months. It actually reached a record high in that survey, which dates all the way back to 2014.
And at the same time, there's a rising number of
hang
consumers.
on one second, Emily. We have this breaking news. This on Palo Alto Networks. The share has taken a big leg lower on a knee-jerk reaction, Scarlett, to earnings that are just crossed the wire for that fiscal fourth quarter.
Yeah, let's talk about what happened on the bottom line. $1.51 beats the consensus estimate by 10 cents. $2.2 billion in revenue, slightly higher than the consensus estimate. But when it comes to the outlook, Palo Alto Networks sees first quarter revenue of anywhere from $2.10 billion to $2.13 billion, a pretty narrow range. Analysts were looking for $2.11 billion, and first quarter adjusted EPS of $1.47 to $1.49. That is higher than the consensus estimate of $1.43. Overall full year revenue anywhere from $9.10 billion to $9.15 billion. Again, higher than the average analyst estimate, and full year EPS $6.18 to $6.31. Analysts were looking for $6.22. So a beat certainly on the quarter that ended, and it looks like a decent outlook as well when it comes to the consensus estimate, and the stock rising in after hours trading now.
Yeah, we're going to get a fuller breakdown of these numbers in a few minutes with Dan Ives a little bit later, guys.
All right, so it looks like shares actually moving higher. There was that knee-jerk reaction, Romaine, that you mentioned, lower just after the numbers crossed, but shares up by 2.2% right now. The company's chairman and CEO saying that they finished off the year with strong execution on the platform strategy in the fourth quarter.
We're going back to our radio chat here. So going back to that survey of from the New York Fed, it was interesting taking a look at the labor market and exactly what it's saying here, because while there's a record share of people who think they're likely to be unemployed in the next 4 months, there's also a rising number of consumers who expect to receive a job offer in the next months compared with a year from now.
Yeah, it's pretty much a mixed bag, but you can definitely feel the turn from earlier this year. There's a lot more anxiety, I think, around the whole labor market overall. So maybe it's time to kind of distract yourself with things like collectibles. McDonald's has these new adult Happy Meal cups. Have you guys heard about this?
Adult
I
Happy
thought
Meals?
Happy
Is this
Meals
with
were
like
for
liquor
kids
or something?
No, they've turned into like a collectible gold mine for these cartoon-themed cups. They've showed up on eBay, and they fetch prices as high as $100.
So these are cups really for kids, but adults are stealing them from the kids.
Pretty much.
Is that
yeah.
what's going on?
Yeah.
Is there an economic indicator here? I'm getting sort of like 2021 FOMO, sort of like, you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm all for this. I remember when I was a kid, you used to, you get the little, Star Wars collectible plates and all the little big movies and stuff. I miss those days.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then go.
Life is simple then.
It was, but you can go get Barbie, Hot Wheels, Beanie Babies, Coca-Cola, Shrek, Jurassic Park, and Minions, or Grimace.
Oh, Grimace.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to
Grimace,
Grimace.
he's
When
back.
I lived in Hong Kong, they had these Hello Kitty
Yeah.
special edition dolls.
Remember when Grimace Core was a thing?
What?
Grimace Core.
No.
Oh, gosh, no.
Grimace Core?
Yes.
missed that one.
It was a fashion trend that swept the nation.
You
All right,
just
so
dress in
tomorrow,
purple, looking like
please
Barney?
dress in Grimace Core.
I don't get it.
Romaine. That is going to do it for our cross-platform coverage of the market close on Bloomberg TV, radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. We're going to all be back tomorrow, same time, same place.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week, and as you know by now, if you've been paying any attention at all to the news today or listening to our program over the last couple of hours, the Democratic National Convention kicks off today in Chicago. President Biden is giving the primetime address tonight. He's handing off the torch to Vice President and Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. Harris, for her part, is set to address delegates in the nation on Thursday evening. And one thing that I know Mark Gongloff is going to be watching for is any mention of climate change, because as he writes in a recent Bloomberg opinion column, climate change is not something Harris has mentioned much on the campaign trail. Mark Gongloff is an editor at Bloomberg Opinion. He joins us from New York City. Mark, you start by the column by talking about how typically candidates look at issues that are important to their base to get an understanding of what they should be talking about and addressing on the campaign trail. There's an exception there that you know when it comes to climate change. What's going on?
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the poll numbers. About 2/3 of the country, this is consistent across Pew, Gallup, a whole bunch of different pollers that are really high-quality pollsters. It's about 2/3 of the country, 2/3 of the people in the country care about climate change. They worry about it. 2/3 of the people want something done about it. They even want the government to help pay for it. More and more people, a growing majority of people, have been personally affected, they feel, by climate change, by extreme weather that they understand has been made more likely by climate change. So all this would feel like, okay, this feels like a thing that you should feel as a politician safe talking about. But the interesting thing is that Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, these are two people who have very strong records on climate change. They mention it here and there, but they really don't talk about it very much. And I think that's because despite how the feelings everybody has about climate change, when you get down to what you cast your vote on, a lot of these people don't cast their vote based on climate change. They base it on economics and a whole bunch of other things. And I think Harris and Walz and a lot of other politicians understand that.
What do we know about Harris's prior career? What has that told us about, how she feels about different policies that would support climate change?
I think there's no question that I think there's no question that she has done a lot to sort of advance the fight against global heating. I mean, she was the deciding vote for the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the biggest climate change bill in history. She doesn't tout that a whole bunch. And during her time as Attorney General and as a public prosecutor in California, she went after fossil fuel companies. She got a big settlement with Volkswagen for using these sort of like defeat these tools that helped get around like emissions like regulations allegedly. And so she's done a lot for climate change. And Tim Walz, meanwhile, signed a bill in Minnesota requiring all clean energy by 2040, and then a whole bunch of other climate measures. But again, they talk about clean water and clean air, but that's Donald Trump uses that same language too, because it's sort of like the safest. It feels like the safest way to talk about this issue without really getting into the nitty gritty of it.
Well, speaking of the nitty gritty, Mark, I spent a lot of time over the last few days in the car. I was driving through Pennsylvania yesterday. I happened to drive through Scranton, where I saw a sign for the Anthracite Heritage Museum. And I thought to myself, coal mining in Pennsylvania, and the history of the importance in recent elections of Pennsylvania as a crucial swing state for Democrats and Republicans. How much of her reticence right now to talk about climate change is about maybe understanding the importance of winning independent voters who are not part of her base?
Yeah, it has so much to do with it. In fact, you know, if this country were, if we picked our presidents based on the popular vote, then Presidents Al Gore and President Hillary Clinton would have solved a lot of these problems a long time ago.
I'd like to have a word with you about the Electoral College, I think.
These are two people who won the popular vote but didn't win the Electoral College and so did not become president. In order to win the Electoral College, you have to basically convince about a football stadium's worth of people in like 6 states that you should be president. And one of those states, the biggest state potentially right now, is Pennsylvania, which, as you mentioned, is not only a huge coal producing state, but an even bigger natural gas producing state. And so, you know, Kamala Harris back in 2019, you know, the 2019-2020 election cycle for Democrats was one where everybody was kind of trying. It was upside down. You know, Kamala couldn't really talk about her history as a prosecutor because everybody was very in the primary electorate was very down on that, and they had to sort of kind of run to the left. And so she wanted a fracking ban. Obviously, you can't talk about a fracking ban now without losing the state of Pennsylvania. And so she has backed away and said she doesn't want that fracking ban anymore. As climate activists, you know, hear these things, a lot of them are just absorbing them as like, well, you know, what are you going to do? Because the alternative, we know her record, we know what she believes, even if she doesn't say it out loud. We understand how the game is played. You have to win the Electoral College. You have to win Pennsylvania. And so we understand when she backs away. People understand when she backs away from these issues the way she does, you know, that she's just doing it to sort of play the game, play the political game that's necessary, because the alternative, a second Trump presidency, would be so much worse for the climate.
So are there any negative repercussions then of her kind of playing this down? I could see a situation where it potentially isolates younger voters, but as you said earlier, just because voters care about an issue, that's not exactly going to translate into, you know, how they're actually voting.
Yeah, it gets down to this balancing act, right? You have to inspire younger voters. You want to get them out. You want to keep them energized. And one way to do that is to talk about issues that they care about, and they care about climate change a lot more than older voters. On the other hand, you also do, again, have to win these swing states. And so you have to kind of temper that a little bit. The other repercussion that I can think of, and this is just maybe me being, you know, kind of a Pollyannish kind of person, why can't we all just get along? I really do feel like, and it goes beyond that too, I really do feel like we should be adult enough to talk about these issues openly without having to fear making people angry. I mean, fracking really is not great. Natural gas can be a bridge fuel to get us to clean energy possibly, but the process of fracking causes a lot of problems environmentally. The oil and gas boom that Biden and Harris have presided over is not necessarily something to cheer about at a time when, you know, you look around and see the planet kind of going crazy with climate change and you know, extreme weather. So the drawback of continuing to kind of keep this in the shadows is that we keep not talking about it, and we keep up this culture of not talking about it. And the less we talk about it, the less we realize, hey, we all want to do something about it.
Yeah, I guess the question is, you know, do we, because you say, you know, she understands how the game is played, activists understand how the game is played. If, you know, the folks who need to show up for her to win don't show up as a result of her not talking about something that is important to them. We only have 30 seconds left, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that they don't show up in is that you have a Trump presidency, and we know exactly what Trump did with climate in his first term, got out of the Paris Accords, did away with a bunch of regulations, and then this Project 2025 document from the Heritage Foundation has a whole long list of things that they plan to do to gut the IRA and lots of other environmental regulations. It would be disastrous for climate change, and so you got to strike the right balance to get those people out to vote for you so that doesn't happen.
Mark Gongloff, he is a Bloomberg opinion editor joining us from New York City. Check out Mark's columns at OPIN Go on the Bloomberg terminal, or of course also at Bloomberg.com. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Emily Grafeo in for Carol Massar, and I'm Tim Stennebeck. This is Bloomberg.
It's 421 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Palo Alto Network shares up 3% in extended trading after the network security company reported fourth quarter results that beat expectations, and it also authorized an additional $500 million for share repurchases. After hours right now, we got Palo Alto up by about 2.8%. The Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advanced today. The S&P back above 5,600 now, close closing at 5608, up 54, a gain of just about 1%. Dow Industrials up 236, up 0.6%. Nasdaq up 245, up by 1.4%. Stocks keep pushing higher, adding to a rally that has already topped $3 trillion from this month's lows, amid hopes that the Fed will signal it is ready to start cutting rates. 10-year, 3.87%, 3.87 to be clear on the 10-year, the 2-year, 4.07%. Spot gold down 0.1%, 25.04 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 2.9%, 74.46 a barrel. Recapping a rally into the close, S&P now at 5608, up today by 1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do really, really appreciate it. When we talk about financial inclusion, we think about the participation of different groups within the traditional financial ecosystem. Think banks and financial services and the like. We talk about people being unbanked versus people being banked. And according to a FDIC survey from 2021, it's the most recent year that data are available, unbanked rates were higher among lower income households, less educated households, Black households, Hispanic households, working age households with a disability, and single mother households. Also, differences in unbanked rates between Black and white households and between Hispanic and white households in 2021 were present at every single income level. One person who thinks a lot about financial inclusion is Sheena Allen. She's the founder of Mindful AI. She's also the founder and former CEO of Capway. She spent her career thinking about financial inclusion. She joins us now from Los Angeles. Sheena, good to have you on the program. How are you?
I'm well. How about yourself?
We're doing really well. I want to talk about your most recent startup, Mindful AI. You're focusing on the idea that helping those folks out there who have a vision but don't necessarily have the skills to or education to create that vision that they have in mind. I mean, this is like the promise of AI, right?
It's supposed to be.
It's supposed to be. Okay. Are we there?
You know, the point of Mindful, so Mindful is the parent company. One of our first products is about people who are or have an idea for some form of software, usually an app or a website. But the problem in AI is we are still full of gaps and biases with a lot of the data that goes into making these advanced systems and these language models. And that's the part that we want to change at Mindful.
Do you see, because a big part of your career is focused on financial inclusion when you were at Capway, do you see similarities between financial inclusion or lack thereof and inclusion when it comes to AI?
I do. The parallels are when I was, at Capway, and I still continue to do that work in other aspects. You talk about unbanked, underbanked. I'm born and raised in Mississippi, so the state that has the highest population of unbanked and underbanked residents. So that was family members, still is to some degree. You look at the fact that Mississippi, I use that as an example. We just got a Chase Bank maybe in the last year or two. I think a lot of people think that national banks are everywhere, but that's not the case. A lot of times it's local banks, it's community banks, and other times there's no banks at all. And so a lot of what we dealt with at Capway was people who didn't have access to the system. And if they did have access to the system, did they trust it? Did they have the knowledge? Did they have the access? We saw an expedited piece in financial inclusion with COVID because, of course, people couldn't walk into a bank branch. But similar to financial inclusion, a lot of the biggest issues is lack of data, it's lack of knowledge, it's lack of access from both sides. You got to think when we got our $1,200 from COVID, people were surprised that a lot of people came out and said, well, how am I supposed to cash this check? I don't have a bank account. I can't get a direct deposit. And I think we're seeing that in AI from the aspect of people are starting to realize just how much of biases are playing a role in some of the advancements that we're seeing.
So talk about some of the products that you have at Mindful AI and how those products are specifically helping Black businesses.
Yeah, so one of our first products is a product called App It Out, like Map It Out, but it's App It Out. And the entire idea of it is taking giving someone who has an idea for an app, for a website, for some form of software, but they don't have a technical background. And how do we use AI? One aspect of AI, which is called Room, is taking text to software. That's the AI piece of it. But the way that this happens, particularly for Black businesses and small businesses, is when you think of Black businesses, if you look at the stats, if you look at the data, most of them only employ one person, which is themselves. And usually they don't have that money to hire a tech team, to offshore, to outsource. And most of them don't have a technical background. And so how do we create something that helps them advance? We were in a digital space, a digital world. And while, yes, it is great to have on social media, so a Facebook page, an Instagram page, which is also great ways to engage with customers, can an app help you? Can a website help bring more sales, more customers? And so for people who struggle there and they don't have that access, they don't have that knowledge, they don't have the money to hire someone, how do we take App It Out? How do we take Room AI and create that text to software, particularly for them?
And how many, give us a sense of just, I guess, the scale right now of Mindful AI. Who are your customers and how has that grown since, you started the company to where we are now?
Yeah, we focus right now strictly on like the non-technical aspect. We have some other products that are coming, but right now App It Out is what we focus on. We're working from everywhere from enterprise to individuals. So it's a mixture. It's not one or the other. Also small businesses. And it's interesting because we have two sides to App It Out. So we bring in customers from both sides. We keep a human aspect to it. So we have everything from like workbooks to courses to boot camps. And then now it's working on this more small language model, really, as we're bringing in Room for the text to software. We're seeing that growing from, once again, individuals to more of now enterprises and small businesses and enterprises. So we continue to see it grow. I think people underestimate how many people are non-technical, but would love to have some form of an app or a website or some form of access to technology that either, once again, they don't know about or they don't have the funds to do.
I'm wondering about the startup landscape right now and what it's like going out there and looking to raise money and talking to angel, seed, and venture capitalist investors right now. What's the vibe you're getting from them when you pitch them?
AI is still kind of a hot trend right now. It is cooling itself, but overall in the startup space, whether it's for myself, I'm speaking to peers, just knowing the space in itself, it's actually still tough. I don't think we will ever see it. I don't know if I'll say ever. It will be a while before we ever see funds flowing the way that we saw in 2021 and some of 2022 before things took a shift. We're still waiting on interest rates to be cut. We're hoping that they come sooner than later. But a lot of investors are not deploying capital. And if they are deploying capital, what's required to get that money is a lot of different circumstances. It used to be, hey, I have an idea. I'm pre-seed. I need this to do X, Y, Z. Now it is, what is your traction? What is your revenue? And if you don't have that, do you have a true path to revenue, to customer traction? What is your go-to market? Is it feasible? How much does it take to get there? So a lot of more questions are being asked. A lot of more requirements are being needed in order to get money. The startup landscape, the investment landscape is still very much a rocky road right now.
How many no's are you getting for every yes?
Ooh, now it's crazy. Capway, I would have probably said 20 to 1.
20 to 1. I've heard worse, like, in terms of experience. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're right. Capway wasn't as bad. This one is a little bit different. It is AI, so once again, you're in the hot space.
Yeah.
But it is the fact that you're having to pitch to way more people now. And I think the issue that we've seen, honestly, or for me, the CEO who's pitching, is a lot of investors are still taking investment meetings, but they're not honest about the fact that they're not deploying capital. And so that plays a role into it also. It's like, I would rather just tell me that, hey, right now we're not deploying capital, and I could have saved that meeting. But I think a lot of investors are still, they still want to be part of it. They want to know what's going on. They want to have the conversations, keeping their network. But as a CEO from the other side, that hurts because, we're trying to raise money. We need to get to more yeses for people who are actually deploying capital.
Sheena, we only have about a minute left, but I'm looking at your background and it's quite impressive. You've been the founder of multiple startups. What kind of advice would you give to young people who are maybe from a non-technical background but want to get into the startup space?
Find great mentors, find great sponsors. Those are two different things. So mentors, sponsors, and find networks where you can find people to be part of your team. Team is extremely important. I've been a solopreneur. It's extremely tough. Find great team members, and networking is how you do that.
Sheena, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Business Week. We do really appreciate it. Sheena Allen, founder of Mindful AI, also the founder and former CEO of Capway. Sheena joining us from Los Angeles. Hey, taking a look at how stocks closed on the day. Wow, pretty much at their best levels of the day. The Dow higher by 0.6%, the S&P 500 higher by a full percentage point, while the NASDAQ composite up by 1.4%. Coming up next, we're joined by Chris Rouser of Bloomberg Pursuits, who's going to get us in the mood for everything entertainment this fall. This is Bloomberg. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We had Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99 newsroom in D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. Former U.S. Representative George Santos has pleaded guilty to wire fraud and aggravated identity theft in his federal fraud case. The New York Republican was indicted on charges that he stole from political donors, used campaign contributions to pay for personal expenses, lied to Congress about his wealth, and collected unemployment benefits while working. Kamala Harris heads to the DNC, 4 points ahead of former President Donald Trump in the latest ABC News Washington Post Ipsos poll, but she's still 9 points behind on the economy. Isaac Boltansky is Director of Policy Research at BTIG.
What I'm going to be watching this week in Chicago is how much does the Harris campaign try to focus the election on other issues where she is the clear leader, things like healthcare, like abortion, like the senior services issues. Those are all areas where she has clear leads. And I think that's why you're going to hear a whole lot about the care economy over the next 4 days in Chicago.
Isaac Boltansky with BTIG was a guest on Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Manus Cranny. As the Democrats' convention is underway, former President Trump is reaching for the spotlight with events in 4 swing states this week. Bloomberg's Laura Davison.
Generally, the opponent, when the opposite party is having their convention might lie low, use that as a time to recharge and strategize. Instead, Trump will be out in the swing states holding one or multiple events every day. His staff will also be here at the DNC holding counter-programming press conferences every morning. So he is really trying to gain a foothold while Harris has her big moment in the sun.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison reporting from Chicago. Groundbreaking TV talk show host Phil Donahue has died. His family says he died last night after a long illness. He was 88 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
4:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. After an initial pop after earnings, Palo Alto Network shares, they're now bouncing around after ours, and right now we got Palo Alto trading lower, a little change, down by about 0.1%. The software security company did report fourth quarter results that beat expectations, and it also authorized an additional $500 million for share repurchases. But after ours, we do have shares of Palo Alto Networks. They are trading lower right now, down by about 1.8%. The Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advanced today. Stocks kept pushing higher, adding to a rally that has already topped $3 trillion from this month's lows, amid hopes that the Federal Reserve will signal it is ready to start cutting rates. All major groups in the S&P 500 advanced today. S&P 500 index up 54, closing above 5,600 at 5608, up by 1%. The Dow up 236, up 0.6%. NASDAQ up 245, up by 1.4%. 10-year at 3.87%. The 2-year 4.06%. Gold down 0.2%, 25.03 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 2.9%, 74.41 a barrel. The Democratic National Convention is underway in Chicago. Complete coverage on Bloomberg Radio this evening. But what about elections and markets? That question for Dan Skelly, the head of wealth management at the Market Research and Strategy team at Morgan Stanley, and he was a guest right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
It always plays a factor in markets in the short run, right? Whether or not certain policies get enacted or sentiment around certain politicians gets reflected in markets, it has a short run effect. Having said that, looking at decades and decades of data, I think it's quite evident that, as we always say, the business cycle and the profit cycle oftentimes tends to supersede any 1 year, 1 month political impact.
Dan Skelly of Morgan Stanley interviewed right here on Bloomberg Business Week, recapping S&P today, a late day rally, moving higher into the close, up by 1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do appreciate it. You know what, Emily? I was on my way to work this morning, and I wasn't drenched in sweat. I was thinking it's kind of cool outside. The leaves are starting to fall. It's not yet Labor Day, but summer's kind of over.
Oh boy, you're trolling me.
I like to be in denial about the summer being over. And also, I feel like in New York City, the fall starts in October because September can get so hot and sweaty. And if you're dressing in fall clothes, you're in for a rude awakening when you have a wool scarf on and boots, and it's, you know.
I wasn't drinking a pumpkin spice latte, but
Tim
I am
trolling me.
Completely trolling Chris Rouser. You hear his voice. He's the editor of Bloomberg Pursuits. He's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. I'm trolling you, though, for a couple of reasons. One is because we've spoken to you at length about the idea of summer not being over and extending the time frame of summer.
I like that.
Yeah, summer. You know, it's a very classic thing in New York for it to get to be the beginning of July, and New Yorkers are like, "Oh, summer's already over. I can't believe it."
That's it.
There's 2 more months of summer.
However, we are already thinking about this fall, and I know on the editorial calendar at Bloomberg Pursuits, even though it's summer, you're thinking about fall when you're assigning stories and when you're writing about the best things to do and the best things to consume in the fall.
Yes, Tim. So commonly in magazines, people do fall culture previews.
He's trolling me now.
Which we do in the Pursuit section of Bloomberg Business Week. And in the September issue, which comes out at the beginning of September, which is fall, we have a look ahead to the best movies, the best books, the best culture, theater, art galleries, things to check out. And those stories came online this week, a little bit ahead of when the issue hit stands. And the theme that we noticed when we were looking across movies and TV and books is that the best, most fun stuff looks like really escapist. So like thrillers, whodunits, science fiction. If perhaps there's things that are going on in the world that you want to turn your head away from, you may just turn your head into a book or into a TV screen, and that might just be a nice little escape. So those are the things that we are recommending.
Are you thinking of things like national politics, for example?
What if you pick your
okay?
You pick your topic.
I'm sorry, Emily.
Climate change, election, basically our whole lineup, everything that we were talking about for the entire beginning of this show. We want to escape
Fair.
from now.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's 5 books on this list here by James Tarmy, 5 works of fiction that should be on reading lists this fall. Which one jumped out to you the most?
So yeah, all of these look really great. There's one called Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner, which is about a spy, an American spy who's undercover with some like eco activists in France. And then there's one from Sally Rooney called Intermezzo, and she's like, she wrote Normal People and Conversations with Friends, stuff that became movies and TV shows. The one that leaped out at me was a book, The Treasure Hunters Club by Tom Ryan, and it's like an aimless 30-something named Peter, has an estranged grandmother living in an ancestral mansion in this coastal town. He goes there, it has a bit of a Goonies vibe. There's a legend of like lost treasure, so he and his new friends from the town go to look for it, and they find out that maybe there is treasure, but maybe it was hidden for a good reason.
All right, the fall, I'm ready. All 3 of those sound good. What if you want to just sit back and, go to a movie instead, not do some reading?
The thing about movies this fall is that the casts are like incredible. Every
Really?
movie, like big movies, small movies, they each has like a wildly good cast. There's this one movie called The Thicket, which is coming out on September 6th soon, which is adapted from a novel. It's a Western starring Peter Dinklage as a bounty hunter who's hired to find a violent outlaw named Cutthroat Bill, who is played by Juliette Lewis. What could be better than that?
I mean, Peter Dinklage is amazing. Juliette Lewis is amazing.
As a villain, as like a Western villain.
Yeah.
There's a movie called His 3 Daughters that is about 3 estranged sisters played by Natasha Lyonne, Elizabeth Olsen, and Carrie Coon, which sign me up for that. And then Megalopolis, which is Francis Ford Coppola's huge self-financed science fiction epic, which has been waiting, people have been waiting on it for, some say 40 years, is finally coming out. And the advance buzz is deeply mixed. So it's going to be one of those things that some people maybe love, some people think is crazy. Maybe in 20 years we'll look back and be like, this was the seminal movie of our time, but it's going to be something that everyone's going to be talking about.
Maybe I'm dating myself, but Kieran Culkin and Jesse Eisenberg together on screen is like, they're just kind of talking to me. What's up with that?
They're speaking your language.
Yeah, they're speaking my language.
The movie is called A Real Pain, and it's Jesse Eisenberg directing it, and it's the two of them in an odd couple comedy. It's kind of sort of Woody Allen-esque, but maybe without the controversy.
Can Kieran Culkin... Kieran Culkin was also in Succession, right? Yeah. So there are a lot of Culkins. You have to forgive me.
There's also a movie... there are a lot. There's also a movie called Conclave, which is about Ralph Fiennes, who's a cardinal trying to help pick a new pope, and the other people in it are Stanley Tucci, John Lithgow, and Isabella Rossellini. Like, come on.
Everyone's been busy.
Yes.
Stanley Tucci plays a convincing pope. If you look at this picture, he looks very serious.
Oh yeah, that looks awesome.
Okay, these are all movies that we can see in theaters, or are these like difficult?
These are all
you
in
need
theaters.
a big.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What about experiences? You guys are also looking at museum experiences this fall.
Oh yeah, I mean we have theater, we have art galleries, we got a lot of Broadway stuff to see, which I of course am a big Broadway fan. Some of the things that are opening up this fall in New York are Death Becomes Her, which is a musical based on the movie, and it has this incredible cast, and it's very, very funny. It did a tryout in Chicago, and that's like, people were rolling in the aisles. There's a show called Maybe Happy Endings, which was a huge hit in South Korea, which is coming to the United States. It's about a pair of robots who, like they're household robots who are retired, and they're just put away in like a fake apartment, and they develop a relationship, and maybe they find a happy ending of their own, and it's a musical. So there's a lot of very cool stuff to see.
So you're excited for the fall then?
I'm very excited for the fall. I don't want summer to be over prematurely,
yes,
but I'm excited for the fall.
When do you think fall starts, and when does summer end?
Well, fall starts, wouldn't you say after Labor Day? Although you're right, in New York, it's really kind of October because it's hot until then.
The first day of fall is like September 21st, right? Just go by the sun.
I will say, if you're going to be at the U.S. Open this year, which we will be there, broadcasting from next week, bring a sweatshirt, because I got stuck there last year without a sweatshirt, and it got cold one of the nights.
No.
Literally, I've only ever been at the U.S. Open broiling.
I know. That's what you think. I know. Chris Rouser, Bloomberg Pursuits. We love him here at Bloomberg Business Week. He is the editor of Bloomberg Pursuits. Check out all of Bloomberg Business Week and Pursuits on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We are keeping an eye on Palo Alto Network shares after hours. The network's software security company did report fourth quarter results that beat analyst expectations, and it also authorized an additional $500 million for share repurchases. Advanced Micro Devices has agreed to buy server maker ZT Systems in a cash and stock transaction valued at $4.9 billion, adding data center technology that will bolster its efforts to challenge NVIDIA. AMD up by 4.5%. With more on the story, here's Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams.
Charlie, ZT Systems is based in Secaucus, New Jersey, and it will become part of AMD's Data Center Solutions business group. AMD will retain the business's design and customer teams and look to sell the manufacturing division. The deal price includes a contingent payment of $400 million based on certain milestones. Closely held ZT has extensive experience making server computers for owners of larger data centers, the kind of customers that are pouring billions into artificial intelligence capabilities. Charlie?
And that is Kimberly Adams reporting. Sources tell Bloomberg Paramount Global, which has agreed to merge with David Ellison's Skydance Media, is likely to extend a deadline for rival takeover bids if Edgar Bronfman Jr. makes an offer for the company before Wednesday night. Paramount Global up now by about 0.6%. Circle K operator Alimentation Couche-Tard has made an offer to take over much larger rival and 7-Eleven owner 7&I Holdings. It would be the biggest foreign takeover of a Japanese company. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletin. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Tim Stenivek. Emily Graffeo in for Carol Master this afternoon. Let's get to Washington, D.C. and get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 Newsroom in D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. Kamala Harris is heading into the Democratic National Convention with 4 points ahead of former President Donald Trump in the latest ABC News Washington Post Ipsos poll, but she's still 9 points behind on the economy. Isaac Boltansky is Director of Policy Research at BTIG.
What I'm going to be watching this week in Chicago is how much does the Harris campaign try to focus the election on other issues where she is the clear leader, things like healthcare, like abortion, like the senior services issues. Those are all areas where she has clear leads. And I think that's why you're going to hear a whole lot about the care economy over the next 4 days in Chicago.
Isaac Boltansky with BTIG was a guest on Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Menace Cranny. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his troops are trying to create a buffer zone against Russian attacks as their incursion into Russia's Kursk border region continues. Bloomberg's Tony Halpin leads our Russia coverage from Dubai.
The implication of that is that Ukrainian forces intend to stay to safeguard this buffer, and that's a challenge for Russian troops who are trying to push them back. There have been reports this morning of a series of bridges over a key river in that area being destroyed, and that's going to make it very hard for Russia to keep its troops resupplied as Ukraine tries to push on.
Bloomberg's Tony Halpin in Dubai. Meanwhile, sources tell Bloomberg News Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi plans to visit Kyiv on Friday, but has ruled out any role mediating an end to the war. Talk show host pioneer Phil Donahue has died. The cause of his death was not immediately disclosed. His family said he had been suffering from a long illness. Donahue's nationally syndicated talk show was a ratings hit and was the first such talk show where the host interacted with the studio audience. Phil Donahue was 88 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Emily Graffeo and Tim Stenivek.
Hey, thanks so much, Amy. Do appreciate that update. I do want to go through at this time, Emily, and talk a bit about some of the most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal. This one, number 2, we talked earlier about the potential acquisition of 7&I Holdings, the owner of 7-Eleven convenience stores. And it turns out that could be a massive payday for the billionaire family behind the company if the biggest foreign takeover Japanese company goes through.
And of course, we were
Goes
talking
through,
with
yeah.
Crystal C about how there are some antitrust concerns, so it might not go through. But if so, the descendants of Masatoshi Ito are the second largest shareholders of Seven & I, with an 8.1% stake worth $3.1 billion through their family vehicle, and they would see how much of a payday? I don't know if it's outlined in this article yet. I guess because we don't have the details of the deal yet, but we do know that they own a large stake in the company.
That's a good point. If the deal does go ahead, though, it would be a remarkable turn of events for both companies. Couche-Tard billionaire co-founder Alain Bouchard first approached Ito about an acquisition all the way back in 2005. That's according to an interview back in 2016 with the Globe and Mail in Canada. Ito rejected the idea, saying both companies needed to improve their standing in the U.S. market before contemplating a merger. I don't know. So where I grew up in, New York City's different because it has bodegas, but where I grew up in California, it was like Circle K and 7-Eleven were the two convenience stores. Apart from like little local
and
ones.
it's almost like a cultural, like part of the cultural zeitgeist to channel Tom Keene. You're like, it's 7-Eleven. It's, on July 11th, you get a free Slurpee, right?
We had that when we were kids, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
It's a big deal.
That is a big deal. I haven't thought about Slurpees in a long time, Emily. Thanks for reminding me. Those were fun after school in fourth grade.
There's not really like a go-to convenience store chain in New York. It is just kind of delis, bodegas. Yeah. So.
Hey, thanks for filling in for Carol today.
Of course.
Check out this story and more, of course, on the Bloomberg Terminal and also at Bloomberg.com. That is going to do it for Bloomberg Business Week. Stay tuned, though, because Bloomberg Balance of Power starts in just a minute. I'm Tim Stanovic with Emily Griffeo. Balance of Power starts now.
From the world of politics